17 police visits in 6 months. That's what it took before the truth finally came out. But let me start from the beginning when I returned to my grandfather's ranch and walked straight into the most insane neighborhood war I could have ever imagined. Before you watch full story, comment down from which country are you watching, also subscribe the channel. The flashing red and blue lights were the first thing I saw as I pulled up to the family ranch after 4 months away. 3 squad cars were parked in my driveway, and standing next to them was a woman I'd never seen before, blonde hair pulled back in what I'd later learn was called a Karen cut, khakis pressed to perfection, and a polo shirt so pristine it looked like she'd just walked out of a country club catalog. She was pointing at my house like she was directing a military operation, her voice carrying across the Wyoming wind with the kind of authority that made my blood pressure spike. "That's him," she shrieked as I stepped out of my truck. "That's the man who's been illegally occupying our community property." I stood there, keys still in my hand, trying to process what I was hearing. Community property? This was the Morrison family ranch, 2,847 acres of prime Wyoming land that my great-grandfather had homesteaded in 1887. My grandfather had been born in the main house. I'd learned to ride horses in these very fields. And now some suburban soccer mom was telling 3 sheriff's deputies that I was trespassing on my own land. "Ma'am," said Deputy Rodriguez, a young guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, "are you absolutely certain this man doesn't belong here?" "Absolutely certain," the woman declared, crossing her arms like she was making a final stand. "This property has been abandoned for months, and according to HOA regulations, it now falls under our community management. We have every right to—" "Whoa, hold up," I interrupted, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "HOA? Ma'am, I think there's been some serious confusion here. This is private property. My private property." Her laugh was sharp and condescending, the kind of sound that could cut glass. "Oh please. Nice try, cowboy. I'm Linda Hartwell, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, and this land has been incorporated into our community jurisdiction. We've been maintaining it for months while it sat abandoned." That's when I really started looking around, and what I saw made my vision go red around the edges. They hadn't just been maintaining my property, they'd been living on it like they owned it. There were folding chairs arranged around my fire pit. Someone had set up a volleyball net in my front yard. There were tire tracks everywhere from vehicles that definitely weren't mine. And there, parked behind my barn like they belonged there, were 2 golf carts with Meadowbrook Estates emblazoned on the sides. "Deputy," I said, my voice dangerously calm, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Deputy Rodriguez nodded, and we walked a few steps away from Linda's continued ranting about property rights and community standards. "Sir," I said, pulling out my wallet, "my name is Jake Morrison. This ranch has been in my family for over 130 years. I handed him my driver's license, then reached into my truck's glove compartment for the folder I always kept there: deed, property tax records, insurance documents. I've been away for 4 months settling my grandfather's estate in Montana. He passed away last October." The deputy examined the documents, his expression shifting from confusion to something that looked like sympathy. "Mr. Morrison, I'm sorry for your loss. These documents clearly show you own this property." "Thank you. Now, could you explain to me why there are people on my land claiming it belongs to their HOA?" Deputy Rodriguez glanced back at Linda, who was now pacing in circles and talking rapid fire into her cell phone. "Honestly, sir, this is the strangest call we've ever responded to. Mrs. Hartwell called 911 claiming there was a dangerous vagrant occupying abandoned property. She insisted we needed to arrest someone for trespassing. On my own land." "Apparently so." He paused, then added quietly, "Between you and me, this is the 3rd time this month we've been called out here for similar complaints. Each time Mrs. Hartwell insists someone is illegally using community property, but we've never found any actual violations." My blood ran cold. 3rd time this month? "Yes, sir. She's called about suspicious activities, unauthorized vehicles, and something about illegal camping. We keep telling her that if it's private property, she needs to contact the owner or file a civil complaint, but she keeps calling anyway." "Yes, sir." I looked back at Linda, who had finished her phone call and was now marching toward us with the kind of determined stride that spelled trouble. "Officers," she called out. "I've just spoken with our HOA attorney, and he confirms that abandoned property reverts to community control after 90 days of non-use. This man is trespassing, and I demand you arrest him immediately." Deputy Rodriguez looked at me, then back at Linda, then at the documents in his hand. "Ma'am, this property isn't abandoned. Mr. Morrison owns it and he's just returned from an extended trip. That's impossible. No one has lived here for months. We've been using this space for community activities since January. You've been what since January? I stepped forward and Linda actually took a step back. Lady, you've been trespassing on my property for 4 months? We haven't been trespassing. This is community land. Based on what? Show me one document that gives you any legal right to be here. Linda's face went through several color changes before settling on an alarming shade of purple. I don't need to show you anything. I know my rights. Actually, ma'am, Deputy Rodriguez interjected, you do need to show some form of legal documentation if you're claiming rights to someone else's property. This is ridiculous. Linda shrieked. Bob, get over here. A soft-looking man in his 50s hurried over from where he'd been standing by one of the golf carts. He had the defeated posture of someone who'd spent years being summoned by that particular tone of voice. What's the problem, honey? Bob asked, though his eyes kept darting between me and the deputies like he was calculating escape routes. Tell them, Bob. Tell them about our property rights. Bob looked around nervously. Well, Linda said. I mean, she told me that the land was available for community use, and we've been coming here for our HOA activities. Bob, I said quietly, did your wife ever show you a deed? A lease agreement? Any legal document giving you permission to use this land? His silence was answer enough. This is harassment. Linda exploded. Pure and simple harassment of law-abiding citizens who are just trying to maintain community standards. Ma'am, said Deputy Rodriguez's partner, Officer Chin, who had been quietly observing the whole exchange, using someone else's property without permission is actually called trespassing, not community maintenance. That's when Linda played what she clearly thought was her trump card. I want to see the deed, she demanded. Anyone can claim to own property. I want proof. I looked at Deputy Rodriguez. May I? He nodded and I handed Linda the deed. She examined it with the intensity of someone looking for a forgery, turning it over, holding it up to the light and squinting at every word. This has to be fake, she said finally. No one owns this much land anymore. The government would never allow it. Officer Chin stepped forward. Ma'am, that's a legal deed filed with the county recorder's office. Mr. Morrison's ownership is legitimate and documented. But we've been using it. We've improved it. We have squatters' rights. Ma'am, I said, trying to keep my voice level, squatters' rights don't apply when the property owner returns and asks you to leave. Which is exactly what I'm doing right now. Linda stared at me like I'd just spoken in ancient Sumerian. You can't just kick us out. We've invested time and money in this place. We've made it better. You've made it better? I looked around at the tire tracks in my lawn, the foreign objects scattered across my property, the clear signs that strangers had been living on my land for months. Lady, you've been trespassing. The fact that you've been trespassing for a long time doesn't make it legal. This is America. Linda declared as if that settled everything. We have rights. Yes, you do, Officer Chin agreed. But you don't have the right to use someone else's property without permission. That's when Bob finally found his voice. Honey, maybe we should just go. If this is his property? Linda turned on him like a rabid dog. Don't you dare side with him, Robert. We've put too much work into this place to just walk away. What work? I asked. What exactly have you done to my property? Linda's face lit up like she'd been waiting for this question. We've organized it. We've created activity zones. We've established proper traffic patterns. We've even started a community garden. You've started a what? She pointed toward my grandfather's old vegetable plot, where I could see neat rows of plants that definitely weren't there when I left. A community garden. Everyone contributes, everyone shares in the harvest. It's called cooperation. I walked over to examine what Linda called a community garden. What I found made my hands shake with rage. They hadn't just planted vegetables in my grandfather's garden plot. They'd ripped out his heirloom tomato plants, the ones he'd been cultivating for over 30 years. The bean poles he'd carved by hand were gone, replaced with store-bought stakes. The herbs my grandmother had planted in the 1960s had been cleared away to make room for generic vegetables you could buy at any grocery store. You destroyed my grandfather's garden, I said quietly. We improved it. Linda insisted. Those old plants were just weeds anyway. We planted proper vegetables, organized by color and height. It's much more attractive now. Those weeds were heirloom varieties that had been in my family for 3 generations. Well, they weren't labeled. Linda snapped. How were we supposed to know? I closed my eyes and counted to 10. Then to 20. When I opened them, Linda was still talking. And we've established a proper fire safety perimeter around your burn pit, installed weather-appropriate seating and created designated parking areas. This place was a mess when we found it. When you found it, I repeated slowly, on private property. That you don't own. That you had no permission to be on. It was abandoned. It was not abandoned. I was away for 4 months burying my grandfather and settling his estate. 4 months is abandonment in most jurisdictions. Officer Chin stepped in. Ma'am, that's not accurate. Property doesn't become abandoned after 4 months of non-use. Well, it should, Linda declared. It's wasteful to let perfectly good land sit empty when communities need space for activities. That's when I realized something that chilled me to the bone. Linda Hartwell wasn't just entitled or confused. She genuinely believed that my absence gave her the right to take my property. In her mind, she was the victim here, the poor community leader being persecuted by some selfish landowner who didn't appreciate her improvements. Mrs. Hartwell, I said, I need you and your husband to pack up your belongings and leave my property. Now. We're not going anywhere, she snapped. We have established usage rights. You have no rights here whatsoever. I'm calling my lawyer. Please do. While you're at it, have him explain the legal definition of trespassing. Linda pulled out her phone and dialed with angry, stabbing motions. Harold? It's Linda Hartwell. Yes, I need you right now. There's a man claiming he owns our community property, and he's trying to have us arrested. What do you mean, whose property? Our property. The land we've been using for HOA activities. I watched her face change as she listened to her lawyer's response. The self-righteous anger slowly drained away, replaced by confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked like panic. But we've been using it for months. What do you mean, that doesn't matter? We've improved it. We've maintained it. Legal ownership? Of course he doesn't have legal ownership, it's community property. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Linda's voice getting higher and more desperate with each exchange. Finally, she hung up and stood there staring at her phone like it had betrayed her. What did your lawyer say? Bob asked quietly. He said. Linda's voice was barely a whisper. He said that using someone else's property without permission is trespassing, regardless of how long you've been doing it or how much you've improved it. So we need to leave? Bob asked. We need to leave, Linda confirmed, sounding like she was pronouncing her own death sentence. Actually, I said, before you go, I'd like to take some pictures of what you've done to my property. For insurance purposes. The next hour was educational in the worst possible way. As I documented the changes Linda's community activities had made to my family's ranch, the scope of the trespassing became clear. They hadn't just used my land, they'd renovated it according to their suburban sensibilities. My grandfather's rustic split-rail fence had been improved with white vinyl extensions. The natural stone fire pit he'd built in the 1950s had been surrounded by store-bought paver stones in a precise geometric pattern. They'd even installed solar-powered pathway lights leading from the main gate to various activity areas. The damage wasn't just aesthetic. They'd driven golf carts and vehicles all over the property, creating ruts in the grass that would take months to repair. They'd moved my grandfather's antique farm equipment to create better sight lines for their activities. Worst of all, they'd painted over his old barn with primer, apparently planning to update its appearance before I returned. Why did you paint over my barn? I asked Linda as she supervised the loading of folding chairs and volleyball equipment into various SUVs. It was an eyesore, she said defensively. Weathered wood looks trashy. We were going to paint it barn red with white trim, make it look proper. That weathered wood was 80 years old. It was the original siding my grandfather installed. Well, it looked old. It was old. That was the point. It was history. Linda stared at me like I'd just claimed the earth was flat. Why would you want something to look old? And there it was, the fundamental disconnect between Linda Hartwell and reality. In her world, everything old was bad, everything new was improvement, and her aesthetic preferences trumped everyone else's property rights. As the last of their equipment was loaded into vehicles, Linda made one final stand. This isn't over, she announced, standing beside her pristine white Escalade. I'm filing a complaint with the county about your property being a public nuisance. Those old buildings are safety hazards, and that junk equipment you have scattered around violates multiple codes. Mrs. Hartwell, I said calmly, you just spent 4 months illegally occupying my property. Do you really think threatening me with code enforcement is your best strategy right now? I'm going to research your property taxes too, she continued, apparently immune to logic. I bet you haven't been paying them properly. And I'm going to check with the state about environmental violations. That old equipment probably leaks oil. Ma'am, Deputy Rodriguez interrupted, are you threatening to file false reports? They won't be false. This property is a disaster, and it's my responsibility as an HOA president to protect community standards. Ma'am, your HOA has no jurisdiction over Mr. Morrison's property. It should. Linda snapped. Property like this affects everyone's home values. Nevertheless, it doesn't. As Linda's caravan of suburban vehicles finally pulled away, kicking up dust clouds that would have made a cattle drive proud, I found myself standing in the middle of my own property feeling like a stranger. For months ago, this had been exactly as my grandfather left it. A working ranch with the comfortable patina of 8 decades of family history. Now it looked like a suburban park designed by committee. Mr. Morrison, Officer Chin said as the deputies prepared to leave, I need to tell you something. This probably won't be your last encounter with Mrs. Hartwell. What do you mean? We've dealt with her before. She has a tendency to escalate situations rather than accept when she's wrong. She'll probably file complaints, maybe even call us again with different stories about what's happening here. Are you telling me to expect harassment? I'm telling you to document everything. Keep those property records handy, maybe install some security cameras if you can afford them. People like Mrs. Hartwell don't usually just walk away quietly. Deputy Rodriguez nodded in agreement. She's already called US 17 times in the past 6 months about various violations and suspicious activities in the area. Most of them turned out to be normal people doing normal things on their own property. 17 times? Yes, sir. And that's just our department. She's also called the fire marshal, animal control, and the county health inspector about various neighbors who've somehow violated her standards. As the patrol cars pulled away, I stood alone on my property for the first time in 4 months. But instead of the peace I'd been craving since my grandfather's funeral, I felt unsettled, violated. These strangers had been living on my land, changing it to suit their preferences, treating my family's heritage like a community resource. I walked over to my grandfather's garden plot, or what was left of it. The heirloom tomato plants he'd been so proud of were gone, pulled up and thrown away like weeds. The bean poles he'd carved by hand during the winter of 1987 had been replaced with mass-produced stakes from some big-box store. The herbs my grandmother had planted 40 years ago were mulched under to make room for generic vegetables arranged in neat, soulless rows. Linda Hartwell had called this an improvement. I knelt down and dug through the mulch with my hands, hoping to find some trace of my family's plants. Maybe some roots had survived or seeds that could be replanted. As I dug, I found myself thinking about my grandfather's hands working this same soil, planting seeds that would feed his family and carry forward the varieties his own father had brought from Ireland. That's when I found it, buried under 3 inches of store-bought mulch. A single heirloom tomato plant, barely alive but still clinging to life. Its leaves were yellow from being covered, but the root system was intact. I carefully lifted it from the soil, cradling it like a newborn. Hang in there, old girl, I whispered, carrying the plant toward the barn where I could nurse it back to health. We're both survivors now. As I walked across my property, I started noticing other things the suburban invaders had missed. The old apple tree my great-grandfather had planted still stood in the corner of the front yard, its bark carved with the initials of 3 generations of Morrison children. The stone foundation of the original homestead cabin was still visible behind the main house, marking the spot where our family's Wyoming story had begun. The creek that ran along the eastern boundary still sang the same song it had sung for over a century, carrying snowmelt from the mountains to the plains below. These things couldn't be improved or updated or made more attractive by people who valued appearance over history. They were the bones of the place, the permanent things that connected me to every Morrison who had worked this land before me. But as the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky the color of my grandfather's old barn, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Linda Hartwell had tasted defeat today, but Officer Chin was right. People like her didn't walk away quietly. She'd be back in one form or another, trying to impose her will on my land and my life. I spent that evening going through my grandfather's papers, looking for anything that might help me understand the legal boundaries of my property and protect myself from future invasions. That's when I found the letter he'd written but never sent, dated just 2 weeks before his death. Jake. It began in his careful handwriting. If you're reading this, I'm probably gone, and you're probably wondering why I never told you about the troubles we've been having with the new development. Truth is, I didn't want to worry you while you were dealing with your own problems in the city. But these HOA people have been sniffing around for months, asking questions about property lines and making comments about underutilized land. I've got a bad feeling they're planning something. I put all the important papers in the safe behind my old rodeo photo. The combination is your grandmother's birthday. Whatever they're planning, don't let them take what our family built. This land is more than property, it's our legacy. I found the safe exactly where he described it, hidden behind a framed photograph of him winning the county rodeo championship in 1963. Inside were the deed, survey maps, and something I'd never seen before, a folder marked Threats. The folder contained 6 months of correspondence between my grandfather and Meadowbrook Estates, starting with polite inquiries about whether he might be interested in selling and escalating to barely veiled threats about code enforcement and eminent domain. The final letter, dated just days before his death, was from Linda Hartwell herself. Mr. Morrison, it read, your continued refusal to consider our generous offers is not only selfish but potentially harmful to the entire community. The Meadowbrook Estates Board of Directors has voted to pursue all available legal remedies to address the negative impact your property has on our neighborhood's development. We hope you'll reconsider your position before we're forced to take action that may not be in your best interests. My grandfather had written his response in pencil at the bottom of the letter, let them try. Now I understood what had really happened today. Linda Hartwell's community activities weren't innocent trespassing. They were a calculated attempt to establish some kind of claim to my property. She'd been testing the waters, seeing how far she could push before someone pushed back. My grandfather's death had given her the opening she'd been waiting for months to establish a pattern of use that she could later claim as some kind of right. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated the Morrison family's stubbornness. I spent the next hour reading through property law websites, refreshing knowledge I'd gained years ago when helping friends with real estate disputes. What I found confirmed my suspicions. While Linda's claims about abandoned property and usage rights were complete nonsense, her strategy was more sophisticated than her suburban soccer mom appearance suggested. By documenting her improvements to the property and establishing a pattern of regular use, she might have been laying groundwork for an adverse possession claim. In Wyoming, adverse possession requires open, notorious, exclusive, and continuous use of property for 10 years. Linda was nowhere close to meeting that standard, but she was creating a paper trail that could complicate things if I'd stayed away much longer. The brilliant part of her plan was the HOA angle. By framing her trespassing as community maintenance and abandoned property management, she was giving herself cover to establish the kind of regular presence that adverse possession claims require. If anyone questioned her activities, she could point to her role as HOA president and claim she was just being a good neighbor. But Linda had made several fatal errors. First, she'd assumed I wouldn't return anytime soon. Second, she'd documented her activities so thoroughly that she'd essentially created evidence of her own trespassing. And third, she'd chosen to pick a fight with someone whose grandfather had apparently been preparing for this exact battle. I made a pot of coffee and settled in for a long night of research. If Linda Hartwell wanted a war, she was going to get one. But this time she'd be fighting someone who understood the rules. The next morning brought the first of what would become a daily routine. A violation notice from the Meadowbrook Estates HOA, delivered to my mailbox despite the fact that my property was clearly outside their jurisdiction. Notice of violation, the official-looking document proclaimed in bold red letters. Property located at my address is in violation of the following Meadowbrook Estates community standards. 1. Failure to maintain lawn to community standards, grass exceeds 3.5 inches in height. 2. Unauthorized storage of farm equipment in residential area. 3. Improper disposal of organic waste, compost pile visible from community areas. 4. Failure to obtain architectural approval for weathered barn appearance. The notice included a $200 fine and a demand that all violations be corrected within 10 days. I had to admire the audacity if not the legality. Linda was essentially sending me fake parking tickets, hoping I'd be ignorant enough to pay them. The problem was, according to Officer Chen's warning, some people actually did pay these bogus fines rather than fight them. I photographed the notice and filed it in what I decided to call my Linda collection, then went about my morning routine of checking on the rescued tomato plant and assessing the damage to my grandfather's garden. As I worked, I noticed something that made my blood pressure spike: fresh tire tracks in my driveway. Someone had been on my property during the night. I followed the tracks from the main gate to my front yard, where they circled around before heading back out. Near my mailbox, I found evidence of what the midnight visitor had been doing. Small wooden stakes driven into the ground with orange surveyor's tape tied to them. Linda Hartwell was having my property surveyed. I called the county surveyor's office and discovered that no legitimate survey had been authorized for my property, which meant Linda had hired a private surveyor to stake out my land, probably hoping to find some discrepancy in the property lines that she could exploit. The phone rang just as I finished photographing the unauthorized survey stakes. Mr. Morrison? This is Janet Wheeler from Channel 12 News. We've received some concerning reports about a property dispute in your area, and we'd like to get your side of the story. What kind of reports? We understand there's been a conflict between you and the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association regarding the use of community property. Mrs. Linda Hartwell contacted us about what she describes as aggressive behavior toward residents who were maintaining abandoned land. I had to give Linda credit, she was playing chess while I'd been playing checkers. By contacting the media first, she was positioning herself as the victim and me as the aggressor. Anyone hearing her version would think I was some kind of land-grabbing bully who'd attacked innocent community volunteers. Ms. Wheeler, I said carefully, I think you've been given some very inaccurate information. Mrs. Hartwell and her associates were trespassing on my private property for 4 months. When I returned from settling my grandfather's estate, I asked them to leave. There was no abandoned land, no community property, and no aggressive behavior. But Mrs. Hartwell says she has documentation showing the property was incorporated into the HOA's management area. Then Mrs. Hartwell is either mistaken or lying. This ranch has been in my family for over 130 years, and it's never been part of any homeowners association. Would you be willing to do an on-camera interview to clarify the situation? I thought about it for a moment. My instinct was to avoid media attention and handle this quietly, but Linda had already declared a public relations war. If I didn't tell my side of the story, hers would be the only version people heard. Yes, I said. I'll do an interview. But I want to show you the property records and explain exactly what happened here. We scheduled the interview for that afternoon. In the meantime, I spent the morning gathering evidence, property deeds, tax records, the photographs I'd taken of Linda's improvements, and my grandfather's correspondence file. I also called my lawyer, Sam Peterson, who'd handled the family's legal matters for 20 years. Jake, Sam said after I explained the situation, this is more serious than you might think. This woman isn't just a nuisance. She's systematically trying to create a legal claim to your property. The survey stakes, the media campaign, the documentation of her improvements, this is a coordinated effort. What can we do about it? Several things. First, we file for a restraining order to keep her off your property. Second, we send cease and desist letters to any surveyors or contractors working on your land without permission. Third, we document everything and prepare to file charges for criminal trespassing, vandalism, and harassment. Will that stop her? Probably not immediately. People like this usually escalate before they give up. But it will create a legal record and put her on notice that you're not going to be pushed around. The Channel 12 News crew arrived at 2 p.m., led by Janet Wheeler, a sharp-eyed reporter in her 30s who looked like she'd covered more than her share of small-town controversies. I gave them a tour of the property, showing them the damage Linda's group had done and explaining the family history of the ranch. This is where my great-grandfather built the original homestead cabin in 1887, I said, pointing to the stone foundation. That barn was built by my grandfather in 1943. The garden plot where Mrs. Hartwell planted her vegetables had been cultivated by my family for over 60 years. Janet Wheeler examined the documents I'd brought, including the deed and my grandfather's correspondence with Meadowbrook Estates. Mr. Morrison, these letters suggest this conflict began months before you returned. Were you aware that the HOA was pressuring your grandfather to sell? Not until after his death. My grandfather didn't want to worry me with what he called neighbor troubles while I was dealing with my own problems. But it's clear now that Mrs. Hartwell saw his death as an opportunity to simply take what she couldn't buy. What do you say to Mrs. Hartwell's claim that the property was abandoned? I say that spending 4 months settling an estate doesn't constitute abandonment of property. By that logic, anyone who goes on vacation is abandoning their home. The interview aired that evening and the response was immediate. My phone rang constantly with calls from neighbors offering support, reporters asking for follow-up interviews, and unfortunately, harassment calls that I later discovered were orchestrated by Linda herself. But the most important call came from Deputy Rodriguez. Mr. Morrison, we've had an interesting development. Mrs. Hartwell called us again tonight, claiming you threatened her during the news interview. I was never within 50 feet of her during the interview. That's what we figured. But she's also filed a complaint with the county about illegal structures on your property, and she's contacted the state environmental agency about potential water contamination from your equipment. This is harassment. Yes, sir, it is. But here's the thing, we've been documenting every call, every complaint, every report she's filed. We're building a case for harassment charges, but we need you to document everything on your end too. That night, I started what I came to call the Linda log, a detailed record of every contact, every violation notice, every incident involving Linda Hartwell and her campaign against my property. I had no idea how long this war would last, but I was going to be ready for whatever she threw at me next. The war of attrition had begun, and Linda Hartwell was about to discover what 3 generations of Wyoming ranchers had learned. The Morrison family didn't back down from fights, especially when the fights came to our own land. But as I sat on my porch that evening, listening to the coyotes call across the prairie and watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain air, I couldn't shake the feeling that Linda's harassment campaign was just the opening move in a larger game. She wanted my land for something more than just HOA activities, and she was willing to go to extraordinary lengths to get it. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new harassment, new attempts to drive me off the land my family had called home for over a century. But tonight, for the first time since returning to the ranch, I felt like I was ready for whatever Linda Hartwell could throw at me. The Morrison Ranch had survived droughts, floods, market crashes, and the Great Depression. It would survive one entitled suburban queen with delusions of grandeur. After all, we had something Linda would never understand. We belonged here and this land belonged to us. Some things were worth fighting for no matter how long the battle lasted. And looking up at those ancient stars, with my grandfather's rescued tomato plant growing strong in the barn and the deed to our family's legacy safe in my hands, I smiled for the first time in months. Let Linda Hartwell bring her lawyers, her surveyors, her media campaigns, and her HOA nonsense. The Morrison family was home and we weren't going anywhere.